The court had 61 witnesses, and not a single one of them was prepared for what happened next. Soren stood at the trial center position, the specific stone floor marker that the court used for accused persons, the place designed to communicate exposure and isolation, the place where she had been placed and told to confess to a theft she had not committed. The charge was clear. The witnesses were assembled. The senior officials who had been present at the alleged theft were arrayed in the gallery with the specific composed quality of people whose testimony had been coordinated. She opened her mouth. She said, "I did not take the treasury seal." The resonance activated. She felt it the way she always felt it, the specific warm vibration of genuine intent moving through her voice and outward into the room. She was not trying to do anything except tell the truth. That was all she had ever been able to do. The first official made a sound she had never heard before. The specific sound of an active deception collapsing. He gripped the gallery railing. He said, in a voice that he was clearly not intending to produce, "We placed it in her quarters." The second official put his hand over his mouth. The hand did not help. Lord Veth, the king's most trusted advisor, the man who had stood at the king's right hand for 4 years, fell to his knees. Pull back. This started 4 months ago, when she felt the deception beginning, and could not name what she was feeling. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The court had a specific quality of sound. Soren had understood this within her first week of her arrival 3 years ago. The specific, layered acoustic texture of a large governance institution where everyone was managing a version of themselves that was optimized for the specific social environment rather than simply being who they were. She heard it as a quality of voices, the managed tone, the calculated register, the specific way that people who were maintaining an active presentation spoke differently from people who were simply speaking. The difference was subtle to ordinary hearing. To her gift's passive perception, it was as distinct as the difference between a tuned instrument and an untuned one. The court was mostly untuned. She had the low-ranking administrative position that her gift's social costs had consistently produced, the specific placement that institutions gave to people who were useful and made everyone uncomfortable. She had been assigned to the court's property records division, which was unglamorous and genuinely useful and occupied enough of her attention to prevent the passive perception's ambient noise from becoming overwhelming. She cataloged acquisitions and disposals, maintained the inventory of the palace's significant objects, recorded the provenance of the kingdom's administrative artifacts. The work was careful and methodical, and she was very good at it. She was very good at it because the gift's passive level gave her an extraordinary accuracy with material records. A person falsifying a property entry had a specific vocal quality when they submitted it for recording, the specific untuned register of someone maintaining an active deception, and she had learned to hear this quality and to request additional documentation with the neutral professional language of a records keeper who simply needed complete information. The falsifications she had caught in 3 years of records work numbered in the dozens. She had never been able to explain to her supervisors how she identified them. She had said, inconsistency in the documentation trail. She had said, standard verification protocol. She had not said, I can hear when you are lying. The court's social environment had been difficult from the beginning. Not from cruelty. People were not unkind to her, exactly. The difficulty was more specific. The passive truth perception made her uncomfortable in the specific conversations where managed presentation was highest. And those conversations were the majority of the court's social life. She had learned to avoid the specific gatherings where political performance was densest. She had built a quiet, careful life at the court's functional margins, the records division, the archive, the early morning hours when the building's social pressure was at its lowest. She had been managing this reasonably well for 2 years and 8 months. The specific discomfort around Lord Veth had begun 4 months ago. She had encountered him in a corridor, the standard unavoidable proximity of two people whose work paths occasionally crossed. The brief exchange of formal acknowledgement that institutional courtesy required. Nothing in the interaction had been unusual. Everything in her passive perception had screamed. She had not known then what she was receiving. The gift's passive perception told her the presence of deception, not its content. She knew Veth was maintaining active deception. She did not know what the deception was, how significant it was, who its targets were. She had felt the specific quality of his voice as the most concentrated deception signal she had encountered in 3 years of court life. And she had nodded and said good morning and walked away with the specific internal state of someone who has just been very close to something dangerous and does not know what it is. She had started avoiding him. This had been noticed, and the noticing had been noticed. And 4 months after the first corridor encounter, the accusation had arrived. The Court Records Division received the formal notice of trial, the specific institutional document that triggered the judicial process for accused persons, requiring their presence at a formal court session where the evidence would be presented and adjudicated. The charge: theft of the kingdom's secondary treasury seal, a documented governance artifact whose disappearance had been reported by Lord Veth's office. She had sat with the notice in her hands and felt the specific quality of a person receiving information they already knew the shape of, and had thought about what would happen when she spoke in the court's formal assembly. She had been thinking about it since she first understood what her voice did. The gift had activated at 11 years old during a dispute about a broken window. Her older brother had broken the window and had been in the process of explaining to their father, with the specific committed energy of a 13-year-old who had constructed a convincing alternative account of events, that the window had been broken by a bird strike. The explanation was detailed and internally consistent and was working. Her father was nodding. Her brother's voice was carrying the specific managed quality she had been hearing in people her entire life without knowing what it was. She had said, "He threw a stone at it." Her brother had immediately said, "Yes, I threw a stone at it." Not because she had pressured him, not because her father had turned to him with skepticism, because her voice, speaking simple truth, speaking with genuine intent, had produced in the room the specific condition where the deception he had been maintaining simply could not continue to exist. He had said it before he could choose not to. He had looked as surprised by his own words as everyone else. She had not understood, at 11, what had happened. She had understood it better at 14, when she had spoken in her own defense during a formal school assessment, and 3 students who had been claiming credit for work she had done had simultaneously retracted those claims in front of their teachers. She had understood it at 17 when she had spoken at a community hearing and watched a local official revise an account he had been giving with confident authority. She had understood that something in her voice, when she was genuinely speaking truth, produced a specific environment in which active deception became impossible to maintain. She had spent the following years mapping the mechanics with the specific, careful attention of someone whose most significant personal characteristic had been given to her without instruction and who had to derive the operating manual from experience. The passive level was always running. She heard deception the way other people heard off-key notes, not painfully but distinctly, with the specific quality of something that should be one register and was another. Lies had a specific tone to her hearing. A specific quality she had come to call the hollow register, the sound of a voice that was producing words and simultaneously maintaining the gap between the words and what the speaker knew to be true. The size of the hollow register corresponded to the magnitude of the deception. Minor social performances, the polite exaggerations of everyday courtesy, produced a barely perceptible quality. Significant sustained deceptions produced a specific dense heaviness in the voice that she could hear across a room. Beth's voice had been the densest hollow register she had ever encountered. The active level, the truth resonance, required genuine intent. She could not produce it by deciding to produce it. She could not activate it by trying. What activated it was the specific alignment of her genuine self with what she was saying, when she was fully present, fully honest. Speaking from genuine conviction or genuine distress or genuine necessity, the resonance was there. When she was performing, managing her presentation, saying words without full genuine engagement, her voice was the same as any other voice. This was the specific quality that made the gift both powerful and uncontrollable. It required her to be real. She had learned over years of experience that the resonance did not compel confessions. It did not force people to reveal things they had not been in the process of managing. What it did was collapse the active maintenance of deception. If you were in the middle of sustaining a lie, the resonance made the sustaining impossible. You either spoke the truth or you fell silent. And the silence communicated the deception's presence as clearly as any confession. The cost arrived afterward, in the hours following a full activation. The specific exhaustion of someone whose system had processed the simultaneous collapse of multiple active deceptions around her. The more deception present in the room, when the resonance activated, the higher the cost. She had been thinking about this since the trial notice arrived. The court's formal assembly during a high-profile trial would contain the highest concentration of active deception she had ever been present for. Beth's allies, the framing's participants, the political factions whose positions depended on managing the information environment, all of them maintaining their deceptions simultaneously in a single room. She had calculated the probable cost and had arrived at the conclusion that it was acceptable. She had thought, the truth does not ask whether I am ready. She had thought, I had better be ready anyway. Beth had been at the court for 7 years. She had understood this from the Records Division's institutional memory and from the specific quality of the hollow register in his voice, the dense, practiced, multi-layered quality of someone who had been maintaining complex, sustained deceptions for years and had become very good at their maintenance. He was not a crude deceiver. He was an architect. The deceptions he maintained were interconnected, self-reinforcing, built to survive scrutiny from any single direction because he had anticipated the scrutiny and constructed the deception's architecture to redirect it. She had pieced together, from the records she had access to and the ambient perception of the court's information environment, the outline of what he had been building. Beth's operation was information management. He was the single point through which most significant governance information passed before reaching the king. This was not unusual. Senior advisors occupied this position in every court, and the position was not inherently corrupt. What Veth had done with it was specific. He had been shaping what information reached Kale, and how it was presented in ways that produced governance decisions that served Veth's factional interests rather than the kingdom's. Not dramatically, not the crude manipulation of an obvious bad actor. The subtle, sustained, patient adjustment of what was emphasized and what was minimized. What was framed as urgent and what was framed as resolved. What the king was given full information about, and what he was given the version that produced the decision Veth wanted. For years of this had produced a king who governed from inside a managed reality. She had not known the full scope of this. She had known the quality of Veth's voice, which was the heaviest hollow register she had ever encountered. And she had known that the ambient quality of the court's information environment felt wrong in a way she could not precisely articulate, but had been feeling for 3 years. She had started avoiding him 4 months ago. Veth had noticed. He had noticed because he was good at his job, and because an Omega Records clerk who had been professionally competent and socially unremarkable for 2 years and 8 months suddenly developing a pattern of routing around his presence was information. He had assessed the information. He had arrived at an accurate conclusion. She was perceiving something about him that most people did not perceive. Whether her perception was conscious or not was irrelevant. The risk was the same. He had moved first. The construction of the theft accusation had been elegant in the specific way of Veth's work. Simple enough to appear credible, documented enough to survive initial scrutiny. Timed to produce maximum institutional efficiency. The Treasury seal had been removed from its secure location by one of the 3 officials whose compliance Veth maintained. Placed in her work quarters during a period when she was documented as having been in the building but not her specific division, and reported missing by Veth's office with the specific efficient urgency of someone who had already identified the most probable suspect. The investigation had taken 4 days. She had spent those 4 days reading the investigative process with the specific acute awareness of someone whose gift made the investigator's certainty about her guilt audible as the deception it was. She had heard, in each investigator's voice, the specific hollow register of people who had been told what conclusion to reach and were producing it rather than discovering it. She had filed this information and had waited. The trial notice had arrived on the 5th day. She had read it and had thought about what would happen when she stood in the court center and opened her mouth and simply told the truth. She had thought, Veth is going to have a specific experience today. She had thought, so is the king. The formal trial protocol required the accused to stand at the center marker and wait for the formal charge to be read before speaking. She had stood at the center marker and waited. The formal charge had been read by the court's senior legal officer, a man whose voice carried a light hollow register. The specific quality of someone who had been told the charge was substantiated and believed it rather than having verified it himself. Not a conspirator, an instrument. She had noted this distinction and had filed it. Veth had been standing at the king's right hand in his formal position, with the specific composed quality of someone who had constructed this situation and was managing its conclusion. He had not looked at her. The not looking had a specific quality that her perception read clearly. The deliberate management of a person who understood that looking might produce a visible response that would be noted. Kale had been at the chamber's head in the governance seat that was the trial's presiding position. He had looked at her, the first time, She registered with the specific accuracy of someone who had been cataloging everything in the room, that she could identify him looking at her since she had joined the court. He had looked at her the way a king looked at an accused person, with the specific professional attention of someone whose role was adjudication and who was prepared to receive evidence. The legal officer had finished the charge reading. She had been instructed to respond to the charge. She had opened her mouth and said, "I did not take the treasury seal." 7 words. Simple, direct, completely true. Spoken with the specific, genuine intent of someone who was saying the truest thing they knew in the most important moment of their life. The resonance had arrived. She felt it move from her voice outward through the room, not as a wave, as a quality. The specific warm shift in the air that happened when genuine truth was present in a space that contained active deception, and the two could not coexist. She felt the deceptions in the room respond to the resonance the way tension responded to release. The specific internal movement of structures that had been held under pressure and were now failing. The first official, Lord Carent, whose light hollow register she had clocked on first entry to the room, made the specific sound of someone who had lost control of a sentence before he finished forming it. He said, "We placed it in her quarters." He said, "Lord Veth instructed the placement." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had not decided to say any of it and could not stop. The second official, beside him, put her hands flat on the gallery rail. She said, "I moved the seal from the secure archive." She said, "I was told it would be recovered and the matter resolved before trial." The third was silent for a moment, the specific silence of a person fighting the resonance's effect with every available willingness. The willingness ran out. He said, "We knew she had not taken it." He said, "We were paid to document the evidence chain." Veth fell. Not dramatically, his legs simply withdrew their service. The specific physical expression of an enormous active deception encountering something it could not maintain against. He went to one knee on the court stone floor, and then both knees. And his voice, the voice that had been maintaining the densest hollow register she had ever encountered, broke open. He said, in the specific hollow ruin of a voice that had stopped managing itself, "I have been managing the king's information environment for 4 years." He said, "I placed the accusation to remove her before the scope of the management became apparent." He said, "The treasury seal was a convenience." He said, "There are 47 governance decisions in the past 4 years that were produced by my filtering of the information that reached the king." The court was absolutely silent. 47 decisions. She stood at the center marker and felt the resonance continuing to move through the room and felt, simultaneously, the specific beginning of the depletions cost arriving at the edges of her awareness, the first signal of the processing load she had taken on. She kept her feet. She kept her face. She looked at Kale. He was looking at Veth on the court floor, and his face had the specific quality of someone receiving information that was restructuring everything he understood about his own governance. She thought, "This is the moment." She said, "The charge should be dismissed." The court session was closed 20 minutes after Veth's confession. The senior legal officer had done the specific professional work of an institutional functionary, encountering an unprecedented situation and defaulting to procedure. The charge was formally withdrawn, the accused was formally cleared. The confessing officials were formally detained pending investigation. He had processed all of this with the specific neutral competence of someone who was going to need considerable time in private before he fully absorbed what had just occurred in the room he was responsible for managing. Soren had been escorted from the center marker to the court's eastern anteroom by two guards whose voices she read as genuine confusion rather than managed intent. People who were following a procedure because a procedure was available and not because they understood the situation. She had sat in the anteroom and let the depletion arrive. It was significant, the heaviest post-activation cost she had experienced. The specific profound exhaustion of someone whose system had been processing the simultaneous collapse of 5 major active deceptions in a room of 61 people. Not all 61 had been maintaining significant deceptions. Most had been passive witnesses, but the 5 who had been, particularly Veth, had been maintaining deceptions of a magnitude and complexity that produced in her the specific overloading quality of trying to read 5 complex texts simultaneously. She was very tired. She assessed with the specific clear-eyed quality she brought to all accurate analysis of her situation, in significant danger. Not from the court's formal processes. Those had just resolved dramatically in her favor and were going to produce the specific institutional weight of an investigation that would not be helpful to the people who had participated in her framing. The danger was from the network. Veth had been maintaining his position for 4 years. A 4-year operation of the scale he had described did not involve 3 officials and 1 advisor. It involved everyone whose interests had been served by the specific governance decisions that Veth's information management had produced. Every faction whose position in the court had been advanced by a decision that Veth had shaped now had a specific urgent interest in the investigation not being thorough. She had just publicly collapsed the operations center. The periphery was going to respond. The anteroom door opened. Kale came in. Not with the senior administrator or the legal officer or the governance apparatus that she would have expected to be present for the first official post-trial contact with the person who had just exposed his most trusted advisor. He came alone, which communicated something specific about the quality of the conversation he was intending to have. He said, "You are all right." She said, "I will be." She said, "The cost of a full activation in a room with that much active deception is significant." She said, "I am processing it." He said, "What is the cost?" She said, "Exhaustion for several hours." She said, "Full function returns by morning." He said, "I need to ask you something that may be difficult." She said, "Ask." He said, "What else did you hear in the room?" He said, "Not the confessions before the confessions. In the past 3 years." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very large question." He said, "I know." He said, "I am asking because I have just learned that I have been governing from inside a managed information environment for 4 years, and I do not know what I know and what I have been given instead of what I know." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need accurate information." He said, "I believe you are the only person in this building who can provide it." She said, "Yes." She said, "But not tonight." She said, "Come back in the morning." He said, "Yes." He said at the door, "I want to say something before I leave." She waited. He said, "I authorized the trial without independent investigation." He said, "I received the evidence through the same information channel I now understand has been managed for 4 years." He said, "I should have investigated independently regardless." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is insufficient as an accounting." She said, "Yes." She said, "We will have the full conversation in the morning." She heard, in his voice, no hollow register. None at all. She added this to the evidence she was beginning, involuntarily, to compile. He came to the anteroom at the 7th hour of the morning. She had slept in the room the palace had provided for her, a guest chamber. Welcome back to the Alpha King Rain channel. Today I'm bringing you a brand new and incredibly captivating story that will surely enthrall you if you listen to the whole video. The story is entirely fictional. The video is created using AI, and it's designed to provide value, entertainment, and positive education for viewers aged 13 and up. Now let's dive into today's story, which was a significant upgrade from the Records Division staff quarters where she had been living, and which communicated something about how rapidly her institutional standing had changed in the past 18 hours. She had slept deeply and had woken functional, the depletion substantially resolved. Her passive perception back to its standard ambient sensitivity. She was drinking tea when he arrived. He sat across from her at the anteroom table with the specific quality she had noticed in the trial's aftermath, the absence of the managed presentation layer, the specific quality of someone who was not sure where his performed composure was and was proceeding without it. She said, "You have questions." He said, "I have been sitting with 3 questions since last night, and I cannot put them in order of importance." She said, "Ask all 3. He said, "The first is about the gift, what it is, how it works, what happened in the trial." He said, "The second is about the 4 years, what you have been perceiving in the court's information environment, and what it tells me about what has actually been happening in my governance." He said, "The third is personal." She said, "Which order?" He said, "The gift first." He said, "I cannot understand the other 2 without the first." She said, "Yes." She said, "What do you need to know?" He said, "I need to know what you are." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had been managing a very large amount of new information and was trying to find the frame that would organize it. He said, "Not as an assessment." He said, "As a genuine question from someone who watched you speak 7 words and watched my governance collapse." She said, "The gift is a truth resonance." She said, "When I speak with genuine intent, genuine, not performed. The real version of what I mean. The voice carries a frequency that makes active deception impossible to sustain for anyone present." He said, "You cannot activate it deliberately." She said, "I can create the conditions for it by being genuinely present and genuinely honest." She said, "I cannot produce it by deciding to." He said, "And the passive level?" She said, "I can hear when people are lying." She said, "Not the content of what they are lying about, the presence of active deception in their voice." She said, "It has a specific quality." She said, "Like a note being played slightly off pitch." He said, "And Veth?" She said, "Veth's voice was the densest deception signal I have encountered in 3 years of living in this court." She said, "I started avoiding him 4 months ago when I encountered him in a corridor, and the signal was strong enough to be physically uncomfortable." He said, "And you could not tell me what you were hearing." She said, "I did not know what specific deception I was hearing." She said, "I knew there was one." She said, "I had no evidence the court would have accepted, no specific account I could give, no institutional mechanism for presenting the gift's perception as evidence." He said, "And I had authorized your trial." She said, "Yes." He said, "Based on evidence provided by Veth." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process this, the specific quality of a man receiving a clear picture of his own governance failure and not looking away from it. He said the third question. She waited. He said, "Are you all right?" He said it with the specific quality of genuine inquiry, rather than formal courtesy. He said, not institutionally. He said, "You." She looked at him. She said, "I have been in this court for 3 years hearing the ambient noise of its managed deception and not being able to name what I was hearing." She said, "Yesterday a significant portion of that deception collapsed in real time while I was processing it." She said, "I am more all right than I have been in 3 years." He said, "Because the deception is gone." She said, "Because the deception collapsed means the court sounds different today than it did yesterday." She said, "Cleaner." She said, "There is still deception present. There always is in any human institution, but the specific heavy sustained deception that I have been hearing for 4 years is absent." He said, "Because Veth is detained." She said, "Because Veth is detained, and the people managing their deceptions in service of his operation are in the process of deciding whether to continue managing them." He said, "And you can hear that process?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to need to understand what you hear." He said, "Not to use you as an instrument." He said, "To understand my own court accurately." She said, "I know the difference." She said, "Come back this afternoon, and I will tell you what I have been hearing for 3 years." She told him in the afternoon. She told him with the specific, organized clarity she brought to complex information, the way she organized a records ledger, not by emotional weight, but by structural significance. She told him what the court had sounded like when she arrived 3 years ago. The baseline ambient deception of a large governance institution where everyone was managing a presentation, which was normal and not alarming, and was the standard environment she had spent her entire adult life navigating. She told him how the specific environment of a managed information court was different from the ambient deception of ordinary political life, denser, more purposeful. The hollow register present not just in social performances, but in formal reporting, in official briefings, in the institutional communications that were supposed to be the reliable framework of governance. She told him what Veth's influence had sounded like from inside her perception. The specific quality of an information management operation running at scale. The way every official communication that passed through Veth's office carried a faint additional hollow register layered underneath the official content. The sound of information that had been shaped before delivery. He listened without speaking for a long time. He said, "You have been hearing the managed information environment." She said, "Yes." She said, "I could not identify it as that." She said, "I knew the specific quality of deception in the communications and briefings I encountered. I hear it the way you hear background noise." She said, "I did not have a framework for understanding that the source was a single coordinated operation rather than the ordinary distributed deceptions of a complex institution." He said, "What is the difference?" She said, "Ordinary institutional deception has a distributed quality. It comes from multiple directions, from different people, for different purposes, and the register is inconsistent." She said, "What I was hearing in Veth's information environment had a specific consistent signature, a single quality that was present in communications that came through his office regardless of which official was producing them." She said, "It took 3 years for me to understand that the consistency was the signature of a single source." He said, "Why did it take 3 years?" She said, "Because I did not know what I was looking at." She said, "The gift tells me the presence of deception, not its structure." She said, Understanding the structure required the specific experience of the trial, where the confessions provided the explicit account that my perception had been implying without naming. He said, "And the cost?" She said, 3 years of ambient exposure to the heaviest deception signal I have encountered produced the specific quality of sustained low-level exhaustion. She said, I had attributed it to the court's general social complexity. She said, I now understand it was the specific cost of continuous passive exposure to an unusually concentrated deception environment. He looked at her. He said, You have been paying a cost for 3 years for something I failed to prevent. She said, You did not know about it. He said, I did not investigate why my trusted advisor was the person presenting a case against a low-status records clerk. He said, I should have. She said, yes. She heard no hollow register in any of this. His voice was entirely clean. She said, There is something I want you to understand about the trial. He said, Tell me. She said, I did not activate the resonance deliberately. She said, I said 7 words. She said, I said them because they were true and I was genuinely present in saying them. She said, everything that followed from those 7 words was the room's deception encountering genuine truth, not me as an instrument of exposure. He said, the room's deception encountered you. She said, yes. He said, and you were going to be there regardless of the gift. She said, yes. He said, because you were the accused and you were going to defend yourself. She said, yes. He said, and Veth's entire operation collapsed because you were present and honest. She said, yes. He said, the gift does not require you to do anything except be yourself. She said, yes. He was very quiet. He said, and the people who tried to remove you understood that the specific quality of you simply being yourself was the risk to their operation. She said, yes. He said, they were right. She said, yes. The afternoon extended into the evening. She had not intended this, had intended a bounded accounting session, and had found instead a conversation that was producing more value the longer it continued. The specific value of someone whose information environment had just been restored to accuracy, encountering someone who had been perceiving the accurate version of that environment for 3 years. He asked about specific governance decisions. She told him what she had heard in the briefings that had produced those decisions, which communications had carried Veth's hollow register and which had not. What the difference had suggested about the information he had received versus the information that had been available. She did not know the content of the deceptions. She could tell him the communications were shaped, not how they were shaped. But the pattern laid against the specific decisions he described was clarifying. He said, the Northern Territories land dispute. She said, the briefing that reached you on that dispute carried the heaviest hollow register of any communication I tracked in the 2nd year. She said, I remember it because the contrast between the signal in the brief and the signal in the independent reports I handled in the records division was the sharpest divergence I had observed. He said, the decision I made on that dispute served Veth's family's land interests in the Northern Territories. She said, I did not know that. She said, I knew the brief was shaped. He was quiet for a specific moment. He said, the Eastern Trade Routes restructuring. She said, I heard the records division's original analysis, the one that went into the archive before any processing. She said, it carried no hollow register. She said, The version that reached the council briefing carried a significant one. He said, the restructuring produced contracts for 3 firms with direct connections to Veth's faction. She said, yes. They worked through 6 specific decisions over the course of 2 hours. In each case, the pattern was consistent. The original documentation she had handled in the records division was clean, and the version of the information that had reached governance was shaped. 6 decisions with specific beneficiaries among Veth's factional network. He was very still by the end. He said, he built a private economy inside my governance. She said, that is accurate. He said, with my decisions as the mechanism. She said, yes. He said, and the 47 decisions he referenced in the trial. She said, I have 6 with specific evidence from my records work. She said, I have another estimated 18 based on the pattern of hollow register in communications I processed. She said, the remaining 23 would require the investigation's findings to substantiate. He said, you have been building this record for how long? She said, I have been building what my perception could build. She said, without the trial's confessions providing the framework. The record was an accumulation of observations without a structure to organize them into. He said, and now? She said, now the structure is available. She said, the investigation will need what I can provide from the record's work. She said, the gift's perception is not evidence in itself, but it is a direction finder for where the evidence will be. He looked at her across the anteroom table in the evening light. He said, I need you in the investigation. She said, yes. She said, I had assumed that. He said, not as an instrument. He said it with the specific quality of someone who had been listening carefully for several hours and had understood something. She said, I know. She said, you said that this morning. He said, I wanted to say it again. She said, noted. He said, when the investigation has completed its formal process, I want to have a different conversation. She said, which conversation? He said, the conversation about what the court needs to be and what role you are willing to play in it. She said, that conversation requires a functional court to be worth having. She said, we have a substantial amount of work to do before it is functional. He said, yes. She said, come back tomorrow. She said, I have more to tell you about the Northern Territories. The investigation took 3 weeks. He came to the anteroom every morning. She had noticed, in the first week, the specific quality of his presence across those mornings, the way it was changing. When he had first come, the day after the trial, he had been in the specific internal state of someone who had just had a significant amount of certainty removed and was working without a reference framework. By the end of the first week, he had developed a new reference framework. The specific practice of asking her whether what he was hearing from the investigation team carried a hollow register and receiving accurate information, and building his understanding of his own governance on that foundation. She had been clear with him from the beginning about the gift's limitations. She could not tell him the content of deceptions, only their presence. She could not guarantee that every piece of information she assessed as clean was actually accurate, only that the person presenting it was not actively deceiving when they presented it. She could tell him which investigators were reporting their findings honestly and which were managing their reports, which witnesses were testifying genuinely, and which were shaping their testimony. He had received this limitation clearly and had worked within it. She had watched him build a specific skill over 3 weeks. The skill of distinguishing between what he had believed and what he had verified, between information that had been provided and information that had been checked. He was a fast learner, not because the skill was simple. It was not. The specific discipline of a mind that had been operating on managed information, learning to require evidence, was genuinely difficult work. But because he was doing it with genuine engagement rather than reluctant compliance. She had heard, across 3 weeks of daily conversation, no hollow register. None. His voice was the cleanest, consistent signal she had encountered in her adult life in a governance context. Not because he was without complexity or without the ordinary managed presentations of social life. Because when he was speaking about things that mattered, when he was in genuine engagement with what he was saying, there was no gap between what he knew and what he said. She had noted this carefully. She had noted it the way she noted all accurate information, without immediate conclusion, with the patient accumulation of evidence that her experience had taught her was the only reliable basis for significant assessment. The investigation's third week produced the full scope of Veth's operation. 47 decisions, as he had confessed. The investigation confirmed 39. The remaining 8 were under continued review. The network's full membership was 42 individuals across multiple levels of the court's administrative and advisory structure, not all of them active participants. Some passive beneficiaries who had not known the source of their advantage. Some who had known and had chosen not to inquire too closely. The political crisis had been building since the first week. The network's members who had not been in the initial confessions, the passive beneficiaries, the people who had known and not inquired, were in the specific political position of people whose standing had been built on an exposed false foundation and who needed to protect themselves from the investigation's reach. They were organizing. They were doing it quietly, through the specific informal channels that the court's political life ran on. But she could hear the organization in the specific quality of the ambient deception environment, more active, more purposeful, more directed. On the 22nd day of the investigation, a formal petition arrived. The petition was submitted through the court's formal administrative channel by Lord Savin, whose family's land interests in the Eastern Territories had been advanced by 2 of the 39 confirmed governance decisions. The petition was 6 pages and carefully constructed. It argued 4 positions: that the investigation's methodology was compromised by its reliance on unofficial testimony from a practitioner whose gift had not been formally assessed or verified by the court's magical registry, that the trial's events, the confessions, had occurred under conditions of involuntary compulsion, raising questions about the legal validity of evidence produced under those conditions, that the governance decisions under investigation had been made by the king with full authority, and the question of how the information environment had been managed was a governance matter that required a formal process rather than an investigation, and that the specific continued presence of the truth practitioner in proximity to the court's governance processes was producing a chilling effect on the court's normal administrative function. She read the petition that evening and identified its structure immediately. The first 2 arguments were designed to delegitimize the investigation's methodology. The third was designed to redirect the investigation away from the specific question of what Veth had done and toward the procedural question of whether the king had acted appropriately, a question whose answer was yes. Cale had acted with full legal authority, which meant the investigation's findings would be reframed as governance review rather than accountability. The fourth was designed to remove her. She was the target of the fourth argument in the specific practical sense. If the court's normal administrative function was being chilled by her presence, the administrative remedy was her removal. The argument was carefully constructed not to look like retaliation, but to look like institutional hygiene. She took the petition to Cale the following morning. She said, "The fourth argument is the most immediate concern." He said, "I know." She said, "It is designed to produce my removal as an institutional management decision rather than as a political one." He said, "Yes." She said, "If I am removed before the investigation is complete, the direction-finding function I have been providing is gone." She said, "The investigation will continue, but it will do so without the specific capacity to identify which witnesses and reports are being shaped." He said, "Yes." She said, "The petition is from a member of the network's beneficiary class." He said, "I know." He said, "I checked the confirmation against the investigation's findings before I came here." She said, "Good." He said, "The petition will be denied." She said, "The denial needs to address the arguments specifically rather than dismissing them categorically." She said, "If the denial is categorical, the faction can argue the king is protecting a political ally." She said, "If it is specific, it establishes a record that the arguments were substantively wrong." He said, "I know how to write a denial." She said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to know that I know you know that." He said, "And you are telling me anyway." She said, "I am telling you what the petition requires." She said, "What you do with it is governance." He said, "Noted." He said, "There is a second development." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The investigation has identified a secondary accusation being prepared." He said, "More sophisticated than the original. Instead of a theft, a false record charge, which is a records division violation with specific institutional implications for anyone who has held a records position." She said, "They are using my work history as the mechanism." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the false record charge would produce a specific formal process that would require my removal from governance proximity during the investigation period." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long before the charge arrives?" He said, "The investigation team estimates 2 days." She said, "I need to speak with the full court before the charge arrives." He said, "I know." He said, "I have been thinking the same thing." He said, "I am calling the full court assembly tomorrow." She said, "Good." She went back to the anteroom and sat with the specific, clear-eyed assessment of what tomorrow required. She thought, "The truth does not ask whether I am ready." She thought, "I had better be ready anyway." She sat in the anteroom that evening with the specific quality of the night before something that had been building for a long time and was now arriving. The option to withdraw was real. She had been thinking about this with the specific honest attention she gave to all available options. She could remove herself from the court's governance proximity before the false record charge arrived, rendering the charge procedurally moot and removing herself from the investigation's political dynamics. The investigation would continue without her direction-finding function, would produce findings of varying reliability depending on which witnesses chose to shape their testimony, would result in a governance outcome that was better than the 4-year managed reality had been and worse than what accurate information could produce. The people whose governance had been made worse by Veth's operation, the farming communities in the Northern Territories whose land dispute had been decided against their interests. The Eastern trade operators whose contracts had been restructured to benefit Veth's faction at their expense would receive partial accounting rather than full accounting. She could leave and they would receive partial. She had thought about this with the specific attention it required and had arrived at the specific answer that her honest assessment of the situation produced. She was not going to leave. Not because she owed Cale anything. She did not owe him anything. Not because the bond, which she had been feeling as a warm ambient resonance since the second morning of the aftermath conversations. The specific quality of a bond frequency, finding something it recognized in her vicinity, had produced in her an obligation to stay. It had not. She was staying because the people in the Northern Territories had not framed her and did not deserve partial accounting for the theft of their land rights. And because the Eastern trade operators had not managed her trial and did not deserve a governance outcome shaped by the same network that had already cost them. And because she was the specific person who had the specific capacity to ensure that what the investigation produced was accurate rather than shaped. She thought about what tomorrow required. The full court assembly. Speaking with genuine intent, the full resonance. Not the accidental activation of the trial, but the deliberate genuine presence of someone who had decided to be fully real in a formal governance context and understood what that would cost. The false record charges preparation made the timing critical. If she spoke before the charge arrived and established the full account in the court's formal record, the charge would be responding to an established record rather than establishing one. She thought about what the resonance would do in a room full of a network's active deceptions. She thought about the cost of the trial's activation and estimated the full court assembly's cost would be considerably higher. She thought, acceptable. She went to find Cale one more time before the morning. He was in his private study, working, which she had come to understand was his standard late evening state. She said, I wanted to tell you something before tomorrow. He said, tell me. She said, I am staying and I am going to speak in the full court assembly and the resonance will activate and the people in that room who are maintaining active deceptions in service of the network are going to have a significant experience. She said, I wanted you to know this was my choice and my assessment rather than an outcome I was managing into. He said, I know. She said, do you? He said, yes. He said, I have been watching you for 22 days. He said, I have been listening with the specific attention of someone who has recently learned that listening accurately is the most important governance skill available. He said, you make choices. He said, the choices are yours. She said, yes. He said, and tomorrow's is yours. She said, yes. He said, what do you need from me? She said, the authorization for the full court assembly. She said, and for it to be scheduled before the false record charge process can initiate. He said, it was already scheduled for the morning. He said, I made the arrangement 2 hours ago. She said, good. She said, one more thing. He said, yes. She said, when the resonance activates in the full court tomorrow, you will hear things about your governance that may be difficult to receive in a public setting. He said, I know. She said, I want you to be prepared for the specific experience of receiving accurate information about your own governance in real time with 60 people watching. He said, I have been preparing for it since the night of the trial. He said it with the specific quality of genuine acknowledgement. He said, I have been preparing by learning to receive accurate information without managing my response to it. She said, yes. She said, I heard that. She left. The full court assembly had 67 members. She stood at the speaker's position, not the accused center marker. The formal speaker's position used for governance presentations, and she felt the room's ambient deception environment through her passive perception. It was heavy. Not Veth heavy. The specific dense, sustained quality of his operation was absent because he was detained. But the network's periphery was present and active. Every member maintaining the specific deception of their own uninvolvement with varying degrees of success. The room had the specific acoustic quality, to her perception, of a large number of people working very hard to hold positions that were under pressure. She thought, I am going to speak with full intention today. She had not done this before. Every previous activation of the resonance had been involuntary, genuine emotional presence. Producing the resonance as a byproduct of being real in a high-stakes moment. She had never stood before a formal assembly and consciously chosen to speak with the specific full, genuine intention that she knew would produce the resonance at its maximum depth. She was doing it now because the situation required it and because she had thought carefully about whether it was the right choice and had arrived at the answer that accuracy required. She said, my name is Soren. She said, I have been in the records division of this court for 3 years. She said, I carry a gift called truth resonance, which produces in any space where I speak with genuine intention the specific environment where active deception cannot be sustained. She said it with full presence. She felt the resonance activate, not the accidental trigger of the trial, but the deliberate opening of everything she was into what she was saying. The warmth moved outward from her voice, and she felt the room's deceptions begin to respond. She said, I am going to tell you what I know about the 4-year information management operation that has been running in this court, and I am going to tell you everything I know. And as I tell it, the truth in this room will be the same quality as what I am saying. The first peripheral network member made a sound. Then the second. The resonance was full and sustained, and she was fully present in it, not managing it, inhabiting it, and the room was beginning to reorganize itself around the specific condition she was producing. A space where deception required more energy to maintain than the people maintaining it had available. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told the full account, the 3 years of passive perception, the specific quality of the managed information environment, the trail she had followed through the records division's documentation, the pattern of shaped communications, the 6 decisions with specific records evidence, and the 18 with pattern evidence, and the ongoing investigation's 39 confirmed findings. She told it in the specific organized way she told all complex things. Structure first, evidence second, implications third. She did not perform emotion. She did not manage it. She was simply present in the full truth of what she had spent 3 years receiving and 3 weeks documenting, and was now, for the first time in full court, allowed to say. The resonance continued. Around her, the room was confessing. The confessions were not dramatic. They were the specific, quiet, involuntary, unstoppable process of people who had been maintaining active deceptions in a room where active deception had become physiologically impossible. They spoke the truth the way pressure released, not all at once, but in the specific sustained flow of something that had been held under more pressure than it could hold. Lord Savan said, in the voice of someone who had not decided to speak, I knew the information environment was managed. I received 3 decisions whose favorable outcomes for my family I did not investigate the source of. He said, I chose not to investigate. 2 officials from the Administrative Communications Division said, in sequence. We processed Veth's adjusted briefings through standard channels. We knew the adjustments were present. We understood them as editorial function. A council member whose voice carried the specific hollow register of someone who had been managing this deception for 4 years and was finding the management failing said, I reviewed the Northern Territory's briefing before it reached the council session. I knew the original analysis was different from what was presented. I processed it as a standard information management function. Standard information management function. She heard these words and recognized them for what they were. The language of an institution that had normalized the operation. It was not Veth's operation alone. It was an operation that had found accommodation in the institution's culture. The specific normalization of information shaping as standard practice. The specific collective decision to call managed deception editorial function. The full scope of this was considerably larger than she had estimated. She continued speaking. By the 40th minute she had completed the full account, and the room had completed its involuntary revelation, and she felt the resonance's cost arriving, not gradually but as a specific wave of exhaustion. The heaviest post-activation depletion she had experienced. Significantly heavier than the trial because the full assembly had contained significantly more active deception than the trial's 6 participants. She kept standing. She said, the record is now in this court's formal session. She said, everything said in this room in the past 40 minutes is part of the formal record. She said, I am asking the court to receive it as such. She looked at Cale. He said, the record is received. Cale stood at the governance position. He had been in it for 40 minutes, receiving the specific experience of watching his court confess. Itself in real time while the woman he had authorized to be tried as a thief stood at the speaker's position being entirely herself and watching the deception around her collapse. He had been preparing for this moment for 22 days. He said, I authorized a trial for theft against a member of this court without independent investigation of the charge. He said, I received the charge through the same information management channel that has just been established as operating for 4 years in this court. He said, the charge was fabricated to remove the one person in this court whose gift makes the information management operation impossible to sustain in her presence. He said, I did not ask why my most trusted advisor was the person presenting the case against a low-status records clerk. He said, I should have asked. He said, a single question would have been sufficient. He said, the 4-year information management operation produced specific governance decisions that benefited specific factional interests at the expense of the kingdom's people. He said, I made those decisions with full legal authority and without the information that would have produced different decisions. He said, the decisions are mine and their consequences are mine. He said, Lord Savin's petition received yesterday has been denied. He said, the grounds for denial are available in the formal record. He said, the false record charge preparation that my investigation team has identified has been preempted by this morning's formal session record. He said, the investigation is complete and its findings are part of the formal court record. He said, the accountability proceedings for the 42 identified network members will be conducted through the court's formal process. He said, Soren will address the court with formal requirements. He said, the requirements will be received as the primary governance business of this session. He looked at her. She nodded. She moved to the formal requirements position, still standing, the depletion heavy in her body. The specific cost of 40 minutes at full resonance depth in a room with 67 active deceptions present and accounted for. She kept standing because sitting was not available. She presented 3 requirements. The Truth Council, a permanent, independent governance body with the specific mandate of ensuring that the king's information environment was unfiltered and accurate. Not an advisory body in the conventional sense. A council with the formal constitutional standing to independently verify the information presented to the king before governance decisions were made on it. With the authority to flag discrepancies between original documentation and process briefings, and to require explanation of those discrepancies before decisions could be finalized. The council's membership would be drawn from multiple independent sources, not the court's existing advisory structure, which had been established in the information management environment and whose independence was questionable. The founding membership would include the Records Division's senior practitioners, whose daily work with original documentation gave them the specific institutional knowledge of the gap between source and summary. She said, the council does not exist because my gift is present. She said, it exists because the governance failure that produced the 4-year operation is structural, and structural failures require structural responses. She said, the council is the structural response. The formal prohibition on single advisor information management, written governance provision, establishing that no single official could serve as the sole processing point for information reaching the king's governance sessions. Multiple independent channels required. Documentation of the original source material required alongside any summary or briefing. Formal accountability requirements for any discrepancy between source and summary. She said, Veth's operation was possible because the information management function had no oversight. She said, the prohibition creates the oversight. The Truth Practitioners Registry, a formal governance registry for practitioners of truth perception and resonance gifts, establishing these capacities as governance assets with protected status, protected from the specific institutional dynamic that had produced her exclusion from the registry. The assessment framework's tendency to classify invisible gifts as minor, the social pressure on practitioners to underdisclose, the institutional response to truth perception as a social liability rather than a governance resource. She said, my gifts registry entry described the shadow walking as environmental sensitivity. She said, no, she stopped herself. She said, the truth resonance was not documented at all because I had learned what happened when practitioners with uncomfortable gifts disclosed them fully. She said, the registry reform addresses the specific conditions that produced that rational decision. She said, these are requirements for governance reform. She said, they are not conditions for my personal decisions. She said, the personal decisions are mine, and I will make them on my own timeline. Cale said, all 3. He said it without negotiation. He said, and I would like to ask about the personal decisions. She said, not today. She said, I need to sit down. He said, yes. She sat. The Truth Council held its first formal session 31 days after the full court assembly. She chaired it, not because the founding charter specified a permanent chair, but because she was the person who had designed it and understood its purpose at the level of the design. And the first session required that specific understanding. The founding members were 7, 4 Records Division senior practitioners, 2 external documentary historians whose independence from the court's existing structure was established and verifiable, and herself. She had selected them with the specific attention of someone who understood that the council's integrity depended on the integrity of its membership, and who had used her passive perception in every selection interview. None of the founding members carried significant hollow registers in their professional communications. The council's first formal action was a verification review of the current governance session's briefing materials, the routine communications that formed the background of the court's decision-making, assessed against their source documentation for fidelity. The review took 4 days. It found 9 discrepancies, not fabrications. The smaller deceptions of standard institutional information management, selective emphasis, omitted qualifications, framing choices that served the presenter's interests. None of them rose to the level of Veth's operation. All of them were flagged. The specific institutional response to the flagging was the specific institutional response of people who had been doing something automatically and had just been told it was now subject to review. A period of discomfort, followed by the specific adjustment of behavior that review produced when the review was consistent and consequential. By the second month, the discrepancy rate had declined by 60%. She reported this to Cale in the morning meeting that had continued daily since the first week of the investigation. He said, 60%. She said, yes. He said, in 1 month. She said, yes. She said, the remaining 40% represents the baseline of standard information management in any complex institution. She said, the council's ongoing function is to ensure the baseline does not drift back toward the specific concentration that Veth's operation represented. He said, the Northern Territory's land dispute appeal. She said, the Truth Council reviewed the original documentation against the briefing that produced the original decision. She said, the briefing had omitted a specific clause in the original territorial assessment that would have changed the decision's legal foundation. She said, the appeal is proceeding on that basis. She said, the communities affected will have their full hearing. He said, and the eastern trade routes. She said, the renegotiation is in its 3rd round. She said, the original documentation showed the restructuring had produced specific losses for the eastern operators that the briefing had not captured. She said, the renegotiation is addressing those losses. He said, the people who were harmed are getting their accounting. She said, yes. He said, because you kept the records. She said, because the records division's work is the original documentation before the summaries. She said, the work was always there. She said, the council is using it. He said, you were building the foundation for this for 3 years without knowing it. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Soren. She said, yes. He said, I would like to ask about the personal decisions now. She looked at him. She had been building the evidence base for 31 days, not the specific evidence of the governance work. The specific evidence of who he was when his information environment was not managed around him. When he was in genuine encounter with difficult, accurate information. When he was building something rather than inheriting it. She said, what is the question? He said, the bond is present. He said, It has been present since I do not know when, but I have been aware of it for 31 days. He said, I want to know whether you are aware of it. She said, yes. She said, I have been aware of it since the second morning. He said, and. She said, and I have been building the evidence base. She said, it is not complete. She said, 31 days is not sufficient. He said, what would be sufficient? She said, I will tell you when I get there. He said, yes. She heard no hollow register. She had been hearing no hollow register for 31 days. She added this to the record. 2 years forward, the Truth Council had conducted formal verification reviews of 940 governance briefings in 2 years. Of those, 112 had flagged discrepancies requiring explanation and formal response. 27 had produced governance revisions. 4 had produced formal accountability proceedings against specific officials whose shaping of briefing materials had risen to the level of deliberate manipulation. None of the 4 had been of VET's scope. The registry reform had reclassified 41 practitioners in 2 years, truth perception gifts, resonance gifts, the specific range of capacities that the original framework had been classifying as minor or leaving unregistered because its assessment methodology could not see invisible gifts. The registry now had a protected full disclosure protocol and a separate assessment track for non-display capacities. 19 practitioners had joined the Truth Council's extended network, not all of them in the formal verification function, some in the specific roles that their gifts were suited for. A practitioner whose deception perception was visual rather than auditory. 2 practitioners with emotional truth reading who worked in testimony assessment. 1 practitioner whose gift produced the specific resonance in written communications that hers produced in spoken ones, which was a capacity the original registry had not had a category for. The founding charter's language had been specific about this. The council existed to ensure governance was built on truth. The people who could serve that function were the people who carried the capacity to perceive truth accurately. The council found them and gave them a place. She was reviewing the second year's summary report on a morning in the autumn when Cale came in. He sat at the table that had been permanently in the council's working room for 2 years. The table that had been moved from the anteroom when the council moved to its dedicated space, and that had become, without formal designation, the place where their morning meetings happened. He said, the summary. She said, the trend lines are in the 3rd section. She said, the discrepancy rate has stabilized at 11% of reviewed materials. She said, that is the baseline I estimated when we established the council's target. He said, the baseline of ordinary institutional information management. She said, yes. She said, not fabrication, not shaped deception. The standard gap between source and summary that exists in any large institution where multiple people process information before it reaches decision makers. He said, and the council's function in that baseline. She said, the council flags it and requires explanation. She said, the explanation is almost always legitimate, time constraints. Genuine uncertainty about relevance, standard editorial judgment. She said, the function is not to eliminate the gap. She said, it is to ensure the gap is visible and accountable. He said, visible and accountable. She said, yes. He said, Soren. She said, yes. He said, the evidence base. She looked at him. She had been building it for 2 years. She had been adding to it every morning and every evening, and in every governance session, and in every council meeting, and in every conversation that had continued across 2 years of building something real together. She said, "It is complete." She said, "It has been complete for several months." She said, "I was waiting to tell you until I was certain the completeness was durable rather than provisional." He said, "And?" She said, "It is durable." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He said, "The bond." She said, "Yes." Outside the council's windows, the court continued its morning operations, the specific rhythmic sounds of a large governance institution going about its daily functions. The ambient quality of a space that sounded different to her now than it had sounded for 3 years before the trial. Cleaner. Not silent. There was still the ordinary managed presentation of human beings in an institutional context. Still the light hollow register of social performance and ordinary political life. But the specific dense, sustained deception of a managed information environment was absent. The court sounded like what it was. She thought the truth was always there. It simply needed a space where it was allowed to be what it was. She thought, so did I. She had opened her mouth to defend herself in a room full of lies, and the lies had fallen down. And what had grown in the space the lies had occupied was the specific, unglamorous, patient daily work of building governance around honest information, and the specific, unglamorous, patient daily work of building a relationship from accurate evidence rather than from what was wished for. And both of those things were real in the way that things built from accurate materials were real. She thought, the truth did not ask permission. She thought, neither did I. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.